Punishments in ancient Japan. This might be the most interesting thing you'll see today. If you're curious about ancient Japan and the different types of punishments that were used, then you'll want to watch this video. Japan is a country with a rich, unique culture that spans back thousands of years. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the different punishments that were used in ancient Japan. The video is quite long, but it's definitely worth watching to the end. And don't forget to give it a like and a subscribe if you find it interesting. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. Amputation of the nose. In ancient Japan, punishments could be quite severe. Not only was there the standard of death by torture and execution, but there were also fines, banishment, and mutilation. Among these punishments is nose amputation. The original meaning of this punishment was not to punish criminals, but to prevent them from reoffending by removing their noses. According to Buddhist scriptures, if a person committed a crime and his nose was cut off, it would mean that he could no longer commit crimes again. The punishment was used more often on the rich who had committed serious crimes such as theft or murder, but it did not apply to all cases where someone's nose was cut off for committing a crime such as adultery or burglary. However, some people thought it did apply to these cases too, because they thought that if someone committed adultery or burglary, then their body would become polluted and impure, so they should be punished by cutting off their noses, so that they would not pollute others' bodies either with their presence, or by carrying out their activities in their presence, since they will now have less influence over others. Execution by boiling water. Boiling water is a commonly used method of execution. It has been used throughout history for a variety of reasons. Some cultures believed that boiling water had purifying properties and would cleanse the soul of the condemned person. Others believed that boiling water was a more humane form of execution than other methods, such as stoning or beheading. Execution by boiling water was first used in China during the Qin dynasty and was later adopted in Japan during the Edo period. The method involves placing the condemned person in a large vat of boiling water. As the water starts to boil, the condemned person suffers severe pain and eventually dies from shock or organ failure. Despite its long history, there are only a handful of recorded cases of boiling water being used as a method of execution. The most recent case was in 2013 when a man in China was sentenced to death by boiling water for the crime of murder. While boiling water is no longer a common method of execution, it remains a controversial topic. Some people believe that it is a cruel and unusual form of punishment, while others believe that it is a more humane form of execution than other methods. Decapitation. In ancient Japan, one of the most common methods of execution was decapitation. This was often carried out using a sword, and the head would then be displayed in a public place as a warning to others. Decapitation was reserved for the most serious crimes such as murder, treason, and robbery. While it may seem like a brutal form of punishment, decapitation was actually considered to be one of the more humane methods of execution. This is because it was quick and relatively painless. Compare this to other methods of execution, such as being boiled alive or being burned at the stake, and it's easy to see why decapitation was favored. So the next time you're feeling angry and think about chopping someone's head off, just remember that it was once a perfectly normal form of punishment. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture was a form of punishment used in ancient Japan. If you committed a crime, you would be placed in a small cage made of bamboo. The bamboo would then be slowly tightened around you, crushing your bones and causing immense pain. This torture was often prolonged for days or even weeks until the victim eventually died. Bamboo torture was a brutal and cruel punishment, but it was also effective in deterring crime. The pain and suffering inflicted by this type of torture were so severe that most people would think twice before committing a crime. Exile to an island. In ancient Japan, exile to an island was a common punishment for criminals. The island was usually located far from the mainland, making it impossible for the exile to return home. This punishment was considered very harsh, as it effectively cut the person off from all of their family and friends. While exile to an island may have been a common punishment in ancient Japan, it is no longer used today. These days, criminals are typically sent to prison, where they can still maintain contact with the outside world. Water cure. This punishment consisted of tying the person to a wooden post and then pouring water over them until they drowned. The water cure was used for a variety of offenses, including everything from stealing to not following orders. While the water cure may seem barbaric to us, it was actually considered to be a very humane form of punishment in ancient Japan. The goal of the punishment was not to inflict pain, but rather to teach the offender a lesson and reform their behavior. In many cases, the water cure was seen as more effective than physical punishments like flogging. Crawling like a snake punishment. One of the most fascinating and unique punishments was the crawling like a snake punishment. This punishment consisted of the offender having to crawl on their belly like a snake for a certain distance. The length of the crawl depended on the severity of the crime. This punishment was particularly interesting because it was said to be very effective. It was also considered to be a very humiliating punishment, which was an important factor in ancient Japan. Crucifixion. Punishment in ancient Japan was often cruel and unusual. One of the most brutal methods of punishment was crucifixion. This method of execution was reserved for the most serious crimes, such as treason or murder. Crucifixion was a slow and painful death. The criminal would be tied or nailed to a large cross and left to die. Sometimes, the body would be left on the cross to rot or be eaten by animals. Other times, the body would be taken down and cremated. Crucifixion was abolished in Japan in the late 1800s. However, this method of punishment has left a dark mark on Japanese history. Execution by hanging. In ancient Japan, there were a variety of different punishments that offenders could face. One of them was execution by hanging. This was usually reserved for criminals who had committed serious offenses, such as murder or robbery. Hanging was a relatively simple and quick form of execution, which is likely why it was such a popular choice in ancient times. The offender would be led to a platform where a noose would be placed around their neck. They would then be dropped through a trap door, which would cause their death by strangulation. While hanging may seem like a cruel and barbaric form of punishment, it was actually considered to be one of the more humane methods of execution in ancient times. This is because it was quick and relatively painless, unlike other methods such as beheading or stoning. Tatami mat beating. This was a practice whereby someone accused of a crime would be beaten with a tatami mat, a type of straw mat used as a floor covering in traditional Japanese homes. The tatami mat beating was considered a very humiliating form of punishment, as it was often done in public. The accused would be made to kneel on the mat, and then they would be beaten with a stick or rod. The number of strokes would vary depending on the severity of the crime, but it could be as many as 100. While tatami mat beating is no longer practiced in Japan, it is still used in some other countries as a form of punishment. In some cases, it is seen as a more humane alternative to other forms of punishment. Sawing. One of the most brutal and excruciating punishments in ancient Japan was sawing. This punishment was reserved for the most heinous of criminals, and it was said to be so agonizing that even the innocent would gladly confess to their crimes just to escape it. The process was simple. The criminal would be tied to a large tree, and then a saw would be used to slowly and methodically saw through their bodies. The sawing would start at the feet and work its way up the legs, the torso, the arms, and finally, the neck. It would take hours for the victim to die, and the suffering was said to be unbearable. Thankfully, this punishment is no longer used in Japan or anywhere else in the world, but it's still important to remember the brutal history of this country and the harrowing punishments that were once used to maintain. Death by 1,000 cuts, ling. Ling, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of slow and painful execution used in ancient China as well as in other parts of East Asia. The victim's flesh would be slowly cut away little by little until they eventually died from their injuries. Ling was considered to be one of the cruelest and most barbarous methods of execution, and it was usually reserved for only the most serious crimes. However, in some cases, it was also used as a political tool to terrorize and intimidate the population. Despite its brutal nature, ling was actually outlawed in China in 1905. However, the practice continued in secret until it was eventually abolished for good in the 1940s. Waist cutting. Back in ancient Japan, there was a punishment called waist cutting. Basically, the offender's waist was cut open, and their intestines were pulled out and very painfully cut into pieces. Ouch! This punishment was reserved for the most serious of crimes, like murder or treason. And it was considered to be a very humane form of punishment because it was over very quickly and the offender didn't suffer for long. These days, fortunately, we have much more humane forms of punishment, but it's interesting to learn about the different ways that different cultures have punished people throughout history. Execution by burning. In ancient Japan, burning was a common method of execution. This method was typically reserved for women and was seen as a more humane form of execution than some of the other methods, such as beheading. Burning was typically carried out by tying the person to a stake and setting them on fire. The victim would typically die from suffocation or from the flames. In some cases, the victim would be burned alive. In others, they would be killed before the fire was lit. Burning was considered to be a painful and agonizing way to die, which is why it was reserved for women. It was believed that men would be able to endure the pain better than women, and that burning would be a more humane form of execution for women. Despite its reputation as a humane form of execution, burning was still painful and agonizing. The ancient Japanese had a very strong sense of justice. They believed that people should be punished for wrongdoings and crimes in order to keep the community safe and prosperous. Punishment was not only used by Japanese people, but also by Chinese, Korean, and other Asians. You can see that there were many brutal and harsh punishments, but when you look at it through the lens of history, you will understand why they had such strict rules. So that's all for today's video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and comment below on which punishment you think was most brutal. We'll see you next time!